this is how our opponents fight. This is how China fights. This is how Russia fights. This is how Iran, North Korea, this is how ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, etc. They are all operating in this narrative war philosophy.
I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Brian Steed to this program. Lieutenant Colonel retired Brian Steed served more than 28 years in military uniform in artillery, cavalry units, and as a Middle East Foreign Area Officer. As a Foreign Area Officer, he served in the Jordanian Armed Forces and as a liaison officer with the Israel Defense Forces, giving him immersed cultural experiences on both banks of the Jordan River. He served repeatedly in Iraq, worked in the Abu Dhabi embassy, and traveled extensively throughout the Middle East and North Africa. He has authored and edited 10 books and numerous articles and chapters detailing cross-cultural influence and Middle East conflict and history. He earned his PhD in political science and history from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and is currently an associate professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His latest just-released book is the inspiration for this presentation, Narrative War, The Philosophy of Social Conflict.
So narrative war was kind of born in several different events. So obviously, like almost everybody my age, 9/11 was deeply informative for almost everything I developed in terms of thought. So on 9/11, I was teaching at the Armor School at then it was located at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I was supposed to take my 12 students to the field that day. And so I had brought my gear into my office. We were getting things set. We were supposed to leave at about, I think it was something like 9:30 or 10 a.m. And it's 8 something in the morning when all of the events start transpiring. My wife gives me a call on my office phone and says a plane has flown in to the World Trade Center. I thought that was weird. And I actually most people don't remember this at all because it did not get in collective memory, but only a few months earlier, a small aircraft like a Piper Cub had flown into a high-rise building in Florida, and I can't remember which city in Florida, but like the front of the plane was sticking in the building and then the back of the plane had broken off and was hanging down. And so when somebody said a plane had flown into the World Trade Center, that was the image that went in my mind, was this a little plane, a commuter plane with, like broken off and hanging from the building. And then only a few minutes after my wife hung up, somebody ran by my office and said, "Hey, you need to come down here." And so we had a conference room that had 2 massive television screens in it, and I headed down, not sort of confused about what the excitement was, and I was standing in that room as the second aircraft flew in. And within, 30 minutes, certainly within an hour, I got a phone call from my boss directing me to take 12 American officers, and so at the time I had 9 Americans and 3 international officers. And so I picked up 3 additional American officers, and I took those 12 over and reported to the Post Operations Officer, or G3, to help them create an emergency operations center, which Fort Knox, Kentucky did not have the manning to do at the post level. And so we spent the next, I'm trying to think, I know at least I spent the next 36 hours in there because I don't think anybody slept for that first 36 hours. And then I went home, and then I was there for basically 2 weeks of my life. But one of the things that as we were going through that process, it was so clear that something had happened that was outside the experiential box. If you think of that whole think outside the box world, outside the experiential box of everybody there. And so that to me was an aberrational event. And so one of the books, my second book that I wrote, called Piercing the Fog of War, ended up trying to give tools to help people deal with or prepare for aberrational events, or what other people, more famous authors titled Black Swans kind of thing. And so that was hugely important, this notion of thinking about how to prepare yourself intellectually to deal with an aberration and to be ready to respond to it, or maybe even take advantage of the opportunities from it when it happened. So if I fast forward so that's 2001. So only a few years later, I was a Middle East Foreign Area Officer, and I was I was doing my training from Amman, Jordan. And so there was a year where I basically was a professional tourist, and I traveled all throughout the Middle East and North Africa. It was a phenomenal year. I mean, I learned so much. It was an amazing experience. And then for the next 2.5 years beyond that, I was an exchange officer with the Jordanian army. And what became so clear was that most people did not understand other cultures. And so they just struggled with this notion of how other cultures think, how other cultures interact with the world. And that was really, I didn't start thinking of it as narrative space at that point, but that's when I first started addressing this issue of narrative space and of narratives. And so I went from that job to a job where I was a liaison to the Israel Defense Forces. So I was immersed with the Jordanians for 2.5 years. I was immersed with the Israelis for another 2 years. And then I went to Iraq for a year. And that's where I worked for a 3-star general. And that was really where I started developing a lot of these issues with respect to narrative and narrative space, and then maneuver in the narrative space, and then narrative war, as it gets, as I call it now, like the holistic part is narrative war now. And I say those stories because that's what, like, it was working with these other cultures and seeing how they interpret the world, and how that's different than how Americans interpret the world, that was so important to recognize that well-intentioned, intelligent, well-educated people can see the world radically differently, which is a huge part of what I try to get at in explaining with narrative war. And then after Iraq, I went to Abu Dhabi for a couple of years, worked in the embassy there, and then I came to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, where I still am and have been for the last 12 years. And I was here when ISIS sort of starts taking over cities in Iraq. And I knew that I just knew that how we were dealing with ISIS wasn't really working, or wasn't going to work. Our style of war wasn't appropriate for what ISIS was doing. And so I had the opportunity. They invited, so the very first Army headquarters that goes to Baghdad is the 1st Infantry Division from Fort Riley, Kansas. And the Chief of Staff for that division was a personal friend of the Post Chief of Staff at Fort Leavenworth. And he did not have enough people to meet his needs, and the international community, who had promised staff officers to help augment their staff, they would not be able to respond for several months. And so he asked for help from the installation from Fort Leavenworth to augment his planning staff in particular. And I volunteered to go over there, and so I showed up after Christmas in 2014, and on New Year's Eve we received a briefing on ISIS and their conduct in northern Iraq. And the guys gave a brilliant briefing, the planners did, and they turned to me because, several of us were instructors at the college, but they kind of turned to us as if we were like intellectual, academic kind of people, and that we could answer this question academically. And so they asked, was Mosul the center of gravity for ISIS? And I really hadn't even thought about whether or not ISIS had a center of gravity or how that might play out. But immediately I knew that was wrong. And so I said, no. I said, Mosul isn't the center of gravity. If ISIS has a center of gravity, it's in the narrative space. And so I just want to say that was when the phrase narrative space actually was born was December 31st, 2014. And then I had to explain to people what on earth is this narrative space, what does it mean, and how does that work. And so for the last really 10 years, what is now this the book Narrative War, The Philosophy of Social Conflict, that book sort of is an amalgamation of all of the work, not just for the last 10 years, but going all the way back to 9/11 and trying to encapsulate all those ideas and how they play out. So that's kind of the genesis of the thinking. And then now I want to get to maybe some of the key ideas in the thinking and why those ideas matter. So I'm going to talk about big ideas, and then I'm going to talk about rules. And then I'm going to get a couple points that I think are really important. So I might jump around a little bit here as I try to make sure that we capture some of the big ideas properly. So the first big idea is that, well, it's my definition of war. So I say that war is the effort to change an opponent to conform with the will and virtue or values of the actor. And I emphasize that war is fundamentally an influence operation. Karl Clausewitz, we teach him a lot, and we talk about how he emphasizes that war is a contest of wills. Well, if war is a contest of wills, what is it that generates the will of your opponent, or what generates your own will? And I would argue, and I call it, for lack of a better term, virtue. And what I mean by virtue is not necessarily the current definition of virtue. It's sort of a Machiavellian. When Machiavelli writes in either The Prince or his other writings, he uses the Latin word virtu. And what virtu is a combination of skills and commitment and determination. And so it's both a skill issue and a determination issue. And then the question is, so that aspect, what gives you determination is what creates your will. So what is that? Is it religious? Is it secular? Is it money? What is the motivation for a person to fight? So we bombed the Taliban for 20 years. We killed them, we attacked them, we were militarily dominant, and yet ultimately they won. Why did they stay in the fight year after year after year after year? That is a question of will. And then we have to understand what drives their will. So, and the reason I bring this up is, even though we all recognize that, almost everybody will quote that line from Clausewitz. They'll all talk about how, and we all sort of agree with Clausewitz that war is a contest of wills. But yet, when we do our intelligence preparation of the battlefield or our joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment, JIPO, when we do those tasks, we almost spend no time talking about what is the enemy's will and what drives the enemy's will. So one of the things I believe is true, and I talk about narrative as a geological metaphor. So it has terrain, it has space, just like the physical environment has space, which is why I talk about narrative space, and I talk about narrative space landscape, because there's a shape to it. There are things that have greater emphasis. So there's key terrain in narrative space. There's decisive terrain. So you can do the same sort of, whether you do OC or OCOCO or however you do it, you can do that for narrative space just as you do for the physical space. What are the avenues of approach, etc. And one of the reality, well, I believe, like I give this definition of war, it's the effort to change an opponent or to conform with my will. Right? I'm going to war because you're not conforming to my will. You're not behaving the way I want. And your way of behaving is a threat to me. So I need to change your behavior so that it's now acceptable to me. That's the purpose of war, is to do that behavioral change. So it's an influence operation. It's fundamentally why I do it. So if I commit violence, if I destroy buildings, if I kill people, I'm doing it to influence leaders to do what I want to do. Okay, so we recently bombed nuclear sites in Iran. The purpose of that destruction was to influence them. Well, my idea is that influence rolls downhill. Okay, you can only influence people, or it's obviously easier to influence people, narratively speaking, downhill. So to influence somebody narratively downhill, you must know what is downhill. Like, you have to understand what is downhill for that person. Or if I'm trying to influence them in a particular direction, I need to understand, is that downhill or is that uphill? And how steep is the uphill? How much energy do I need to put into this operation? And if I don't understand the narrative space, or I spend no time trying to understand the narrative space, then what I will do is what we ended up doing for the most part in Afghanistan is deployment after deployment. We're putting all this emphasis to roll a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down like Sisyphus in the mythology, when we handed it off to the next unit, and then they have to roll the boulder back up the hill. But because none of us understood just how steep the hill was or how high the hill was, we didn't know how much energy had to go into it to get it over the hill and actually achieve some sort of permanent gain. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about consolidation of gains and the critical role that narrative plays in consolidating gains. So the narratively downhill is critical. The other thing is, the more you want to influence, the deeper in the narrative well one must go. So if you think of narrative as being like a well, at the top of the well, of the water column in the well, that is the least important stuff. And it's also the easiest to change. So that's where data and memes. So I can post a funny meme that might cause somebody to laugh. That might cause them to maybe think about something a little bit different. But how long is it going to last? Well, it's only going to last if it connects down the column from the meme that I post, through the messages that I'm sharing, to the story that I offer, into the societal narrative. It has to connect all the way down to be truly influential. And so the more I want to shape the opponent's narrative, well, the deeper I want to go, the more effort I have to put into this. So for example, let's say, like, I grew up on a farm, and we had a circular trough that we had for our cows. And it was about 4 feet in diameter. And so sometimes we would get out there and we would put our arm in the trough and we would swirl it around, trying to get the water to move in a direction. And if we spent a lot of time doing that, we could eventually create, it would be a really small whirlpool, but we could create a little bit of a whirlpool by putting a lot of effort. But that whirlpool only went so deep, right? And then if I wanted to change the direction of the water, once I got it flowing in a thing, then I would have to put a lot more effort. But again, I could change the surface direction of the water relatively quickly, but to change it down at the bottom of the well, I would have to put a lot more energy into it. So it's one thing if I want to change how people perceive a specific event, say through a meme or a piece of data. So I can do something really small. But if I want to change how an entire culture or an entire people, a nation, sees a particular problem, then I'm having to shape their whole narrative space environment, which means I'm going to have to put more resources into the narrative effort, whether that's time or just energy. So again, if I'm trying to get that whirlpool to extend down 20, 30, 40 feet, everybody here, I think, can imagine already how much energy you would have to put into that, or how much time you would have to spend to be able to shape that. And that's what we have to understand, that if we're trying to shape a narrative environment for a long time, or down to the societal narrative level, then we must do it for a long time. That if the more I want to influence, the deeper in the narrative well I must go, right? And the deeper I'm going to go, the more energy I need to put into it. Okay, so why do I even talk about narrative war? Well, my argument, and I say this in the preface of my book, I don't actually expect the army to change how it's going to conduct itself. Okay, the army and the military-industrial complex makes a lot of money off of making tanks and precision munitions. And so this emphasis on narrative is not something that is probably going to change us, even though I put a lot of effort into trying to help my students see it from a narrative perspective. That said, this is how our opponents fight. This is how China fights. This is how Russia fights. This is how Iran, North Korea, this is how ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, etc. They are all operating in this narrative war philosophy. So if nothing else, one needs to understand this to understand how the enemy is trying to conduct itself. And when I say this, I don't mean in a specific tactical course of action. The point is, how are they using their violence, which they might express in a tactical action, from as part of a larger process. And so the key things they're trying to do are disruption, displacement, and exhaustion. So the idea here, I'm a frustrated geologist. So unfortunately, as an undergraduate in college, Chemistry 105 hit me very hard. And so the reason I'm a historian and not a geologist is because of Chemistry 105. But the geologic metaphor works. And so the idea is that everybody has a core identity, right? That core identity doesn't change very much. But we have enduring narratives, and those enduring narratives, just like the landscape around us, change. And I want to talk about how that works in a second. And then there's this transient narrative environment, which are it's the news, it's the conspiracy theories, it's all the things it's the narrative environment we're inundated with. So social media, all that stuff that hits us, that's transient narrative. But the enduring narrative is how we filter that and whether we believe things are true or not. So the Donald J. Trump is a gift to understanding narrative, because I'm going to give an example, and I expect everybody is going to have something. I don't know. And it doesn't really matter whether you like Trump or you hate Trump. The simple reality is you've already seen this example, right? So Donald Trump will say, do, or post something, and there will be people who will look at what he said, did, or posted, and they will think it is brilliant or hilarious or the most important thing ever. There will be other people who will look at that same action, that same statement, or that same post, and they will think it was embarrassing and horrible, and it's a stain on America's reputation, right? Now, this isn't because one person is honest and the other person is a corrupt liar. This is because both people are interpreting the same amount of this transient narrative, statement, action, or post through different enduring narratives. So that transient event is flowing downhill in one case in a positive way, and it's flowing downhill in another case in a negative way. And recognizing that those two different narratives exist, those are two different enduring narratives. Okay, so one could make the argument, and I think this is probably true if we were doing this from a psychoanalytical way, that every single human being has a discrete and different and unique enduring narrative. So there are 7 billion narratives on planet Earth. And when you look at this in the sense of decision advantage, right, and you look at this like what AI could do, it is possible that eventually AI might be able to do the calculations for 7 billion individual narratives. And to a degree, social media does this a little bit already, right? That's part of what social media does. It's part of what the marketing algorithms do a little bit. Like, we're not fully there, but they are tinkering with the individual aspect of shopping decisions or separate likes or dislikes that individuals have. But that's not very useful from a military standpoint. It's not very useful from a national security standpoint, because we can't think about 7 billion different, or even if we're going into a country like Iraq, 15 million different personal narratives. So my argument is, at a hyper simplistic level, there is a societal narrative. Okay. Now, the more complex a culture is, there might be multiple societal narratives. There probably is in almost every place. So a place like Singapore, that's basically a city-state, there might be one societal narrative. But for a place like Iraq, there's at a minimum, you have some Kurdish societal narrative. You probably have a Sunni Arab societal narrative. You probably have a Shia Arab societal narrative. And then you probably have some other ones. But the idea is to recognize that there's a societal narrative. And so what a narrative entrepreneur wants to do, well, first, every government then offers a story that it tries to map onto that societal narrative. And so what's beautiful about politics is every political campaign is a narrative war. And because what every political candidate is trying to do is to map their story for why people should vote for them onto the societal narrative. So the societal narrative of the voters, they want them to understand that my story is going to solve for your dissonance. Okay? Now, because, and I guess spoiler alert for the people in the audience, no government is perfect. And because no government is perfect, there's always some disruption between the governing story and the societal narrative. Okay, so what a narrative entrepreneur does, and when I use narrative entrepreneur, one, it's kind of an academic-like term, but it's also true because, again, narrative war applies to business. So almost every marketing, iPhones versus Android, that's a narrative war that's going on. Amazon versus, I can't think of the Chinese version of it. That is a narrative war that's going on, right? Walmart versus Kmart, back when Kmart was a thing. There was a narrative war going on, right? Every political campaign is a narrative war. War is a narrative war. World War II was a narrative war. So narrative war goes everything from what is seemingly relatively benign business competition to actual, if you're familiar with the movie War Games, global thermonuclear war. Like it's the whole spectrum of social conflict fits within narrative war. So anybody trying to take advantage of this narrative opportunities is a narrative entrepreneur. So what do they want to do? They want to do two things. First, they want to expand the existing disruption. So they want to expand the story of the government story and make that disruption greater. Okay, so make it bigger. And then the other thing they want to do is they want to interpose their story in between the governing story and the societal narrative. So if you look at it from an example of the Taliban, what the Taliban were trying to do was to say that we are more, so let's in simplistic sense, let's say that the Afghan societal narrative was two things. One, Afghans are Muslim, and two, Afghans oppose outside invaders. Okay, so for the Taliban, what they were trying to say is we are more Muslim than the Afghan national government, and that we oppose the outside invader more than the Afghan national government does, right? And so already you should go, oh yeah, that's kind of obvious because the Afghan national government was working with the outside invader, me being us, so that would have been easy. Right, so this is a part of our problem. Like we didn't even understand the Afghan narrative to recognize how well our story mapped onto that societal narrative and how easy it was to, how we were making the Taliban's job easy to interpose their story in between ours, or the government's, and the societal narrative. Okay, so they want to disrupt. Now, they want to ultimately turn that disruption into displacement. So you saw that when ISIS went into Iraq, and particularly when they attacked Mosul in 2014, and in just 6 days, the Iraqi security forces literally left Mosul. They displaced them from the city of Mosul, and ISIS was in charge of that city. So that is literal physical displacement. The police leave. Now, it doesn't always have to be that. In some cases, it might just be that the police turn a blind eye. So you see this with criminal organizations, either in American cities or in foreign countries, where you'll see that the police will just allow organized crime to conduct their behavior. The police aren't going to look into certain homes in certain neighborhoods, or they're not going to go into certain businesses, or etc. Right? So it doesn't always have to be that the police must leave. That's sort of the extreme of that. It could be as simple as the police look the other way. And that displacement is a critical thing. And then the fundamental theory that everybody's trying to pitch is one of exhaustion. Okay, so what the ultimate strategy is one where they seek to exhaust us. So it is an attack. So the difference between exhaustion and attrition, both are long-term strategies. Attrition is, I'm going to wear you down by destroying your stuff or killing your people. Exhaustion is, I'm going to wear you down by attacking your will. So it's an emotional, psychological thing that I'm going to do this usually over time. If I attack and I successfully defeat your will in short measure, that strategy is referred to as dislocation. So dislocation and exhaustion are both will targeted. Okay. So fundamentally, they're going to wear it down over time, partly because they recognize that they can't compete with America technologically. And so they're going to beat us down over time. So this is part of China's effort or energy with respect to TikTok. So they're using TikTok because they're hoping over years to get us to hate ourselves, to fight amongst ourselves enough that when they finally move on Taiwan, America won't do anything. And so they don't have to worry about it because Americans are so fighting each other. There's more to that, but that's just a quick example. So the third part is all war issues are domestic. I'm betting that this group is a relatively young group who follows this podcast. So I'm kind of imagining that they're not very familiar with a guy named Tip O'Neill. So a guy named Thomas P. O'Neill, he's from Massachusetts. He was a U.S. congressman from Boston. He was a stereotypical Bostonian Irishman, Irish Catholic guy. And he was a member of the House of Representatives back in, I think it was 40 plus years. Anyway, but he was Speaker of the House when Ronald Reagan was president. And he was famous for making a statement that he didn't originate, but he used it a lot, that all politics are local. And he was absolutely right. So all war issues, all national security issues are domestic, meaning that if you want to understand why a nation is conducting itself, you need to understand what is their narrative space landscape, what inclines them to behave the way they do domestically, but you also need to understand your own domestic landscape. The reason why America does what it does, whether that's bombing Iran, whether that's invading Iraq in 2003, whatever it is, there are domestic reasons why we act that way. And we could peel that back, but that's a key thing. So this is another reason why you need to understand the narrative space landscape, because your opponent isn't behaving the way he is just because your opponent wants to kill you or because your opponent hates you. Almost never is it that. It's because of some domestic issue that's happening in their country. And again, we rarely talk about that when we talk about the operational environment. And then there are two currencies in narrative war. One is the management of human suffering, and the other is the attention economy. Meaning that people are like, what makes narrative war work is the ability to control or attack or focus on human suffering. It isn't necessarily because you want to alleviate it, but you want to take advantage of it. So President Biden used an open border to then generate human suffering in a way that he could use politically. Donald Trump is closing the border so that he can use the human suffering in a way that benefits him politically. In the case, he's trying to control the human suffering that happens at the border. Maybe he's trying to, again, anything with Trump, you have both sides, and people are going to give both examples. And some people see him as an evil manipulator, and other people see him as a beneficent leader. And it really, well, in part, that makes my point that there are different ways to look at this. But the whole idea is that managing human suffering is what war is about in the 21st century. We almost never think about that because we always think we're the good guys and we're trying to make their life better. And we don't realize that that's not really what governments are doing, even if soldiers are trying to do that. The other part is the attention economy. So, meaning, and I'll just do this in brief, meaning that people can only think about one thing at a time. You can only focus on one thing at a time. And therefore, controlling where that focus is a critical part of leadership. And so you see this throughout what politicians try to do, what leaders try to do is if people are focusing on something they don't like, they'll try to redirect them. Okay? So you could look at it this way. So Trump was having lots and lots of success, and then this Jeffrey Epstein thing happened and was released. People focused on that. And then the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, releases a thing about the Obama administration and their attack on Donald Trump. And you could, like everybody ought to recognize that is an attention economy thing. And the notion is it's not an information economy because what drives an economy is not what's ubiquitous, it's what's scarce. And in 2025, information is not scarce, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and everybody has access to information. What is scarce is your attention. You can only, contrary to what people think about in terms of like multitasking, you can actually only pay attention to one thing at a time. And you might be able to task switch very quickly between two things, but you can still only focus on one thing at a time, and you have to switch back and forth. So that ability to control where people think is a huge part of this narrative war. So that's another reason to understand what's going on. Okay, so I say this to units all the time with 5. This is never about counter-narrative. So for all the field artillery guys out there, imagine if somebody just came up with a fire plan that was focused entirely on counter-battery fire. Everybody would think that that was a silly fire plan. Okay, counter-battery fire may be important, but it is not the only thing you do. And so when you're dealing with an opposing narrative, you should not focus on counter-narrative. You might need to do it, but that should not be the most important thing you should do. What you should be doing is offering a proactive story. And because humans, I cannot remember the guy who came up with the term, but I saw this term and I really love it. He referred to human beings as homo narratus. We are storytelling animals. Like we naturally comprehend the world through stories. I was talking earlier today about the importance of imploding stories. So if you're going to create any sort of information, one of the things I hate about how we brief operations orders in the military is we don't brief them as stories. We usually brief them as discrete bits of information. But people remember stories. So for those of you who are not familiar with the movie The Dirty Dozen, I would take you back to how they memorized their attack that they do at the end of the movie, and they do so by making it a nursery rhyme, but in reality what they're doing is they're telling a story to themselves with a bunch of different steps that they number, and they do it in rhyme, but it's still a story. And what they did was they implotted, meaning they took and they made it a part of the plot, each of their actions. Okay, so if you want people to remember something, you need to implot it, put it in a story. And so if you want to tell people things, like why we're in a country, what is your story? Whether that's for your own soldiers, for the enemy, or for your partners. Ideally, the perfect world would be one story answers all three groups. Okay, but since we're not in a perfect world, often we're stuck with potentially making up multiple stories. But you need to, like the reason why soldiers will violate ROE is because the story they're told is weak and makes no sense to them. And they think it's silly. And they'll look and go, well, this makes no sense. So if this makes no sense, then these rules make no sense and I can violate the rules. So you need to make sure the story makes sense and you implot the ROE within that story, right? So, and because what that does is stories help people comprehend the world. they express your narrative in the world, but they also solve for cognitive dissonance. So when the world does not match up with reality, so your narrative and reality don't match, that generates cognitive dissonance. And stories help solve that. So for example, maybe my narrative is I'm a great athlete. But then I have a really, really bad competition. Well, that creates cognitive dissonance. I'm a great athlete, but I didn't do well. Okay, but why is that? Well, I'm immediately, without any conscious effort, going to come up with a story. That story might be I overtrained. It might be I didn't get enough sleep, or I didn't get good nutrition, or whatever it is. Okay? We call those stories a lot of times excuses, but excuses are stories, and they're part of this imploded process. So human beings are going to do that. The other part I would offer for narrative war is you're never going to know everything you need to know about the narrative of the environment you're going into. So what you have to figure out is, how do you live your learning? How do you always learn about the environment and do that as a constant effort? So, I just learned something about this narrative space landscape. This is how I think it is. And then how do I share that with the rest of the command so that we're all better on the narrative as we go? Okay, so those are the big ideas. Here are the 4 rules. So first, rule 1, actors act in accordance with their narratives, meaning they do what they are. Okay, so nobody should be shocked when the Taliban, like they said, we're going to let women be educated, we're going to let them go to school, and then where are they now? We're now, almost 4 years after they took over Kabul. Women are not allowed in school. Why is that? Because their narrative was that they were not going to let women be educated. So yes, they'll say certain things, but the reality is they are always going to be who they are. They're going to do what they are. That's the first rule. Don't ever forget that. Rule 2, actors actually publish their narrative. They write what they are, or they say what they are, but most of them write about it. ISIS told us who they were. One of the things I recommend guys read to understand ISIS and also Al-Qaeda is to read The Management of Savagery. They told us in 2004 how they were going to act. Just like Hitler in Mein Kampf told everybody how he was going to act. It was not a secret. Nothing of it is hidden. The Chinese have told us what they're trying to do. So when people say, China's not our enemy, it's like, no, China's told us they're our enemy. And they've told us how they want to rewrite the world order. So, which gets to rule 3. Okay, all international relations are local. Already talked about that. That was, in fact, one of the big points. Meaning they act in accordance with what matters to them locally. So like the Taliban, we think, the Taliban are going to change because they need to have good relations with their neighbors. No, the Taliban need to have good relations with the Taliban, with their supporters inside Afghanistan. That's the most important thing. If those cats can't get along, then this thing is going to fall apart. So most importantly, because if the Taliban have a bad relationship with the United States, does that really matter to them? No. So they're never going to kiss up to the West just because it gets them better, which leads us to rule 4. Money does not change what actors are. So because I wrote these like mathematical rules, there are corollaries to rule 4. Corollary A, if an actor is already corrupt, then you can buy it off. Okay? But corollary B is if an actor is not already corrupt, and by corrupt what I mean is you can change their behavior by offering them resources. Okay? And so if an actor is not already corrupt, then it cannot be bought off. Or it must first be corrupted, and then you refer back to corollary A, meaning you can buy them off. Okay, those are really important. So here's the other thing I would offer for narrative space or why narrative war matters to normal people. There's a bunch of reasons. Hopefully they're clear, because this isn't a battalion commander or senior leader or even a middle management issue in a business or whatever. This is everybody all up and down the chain need to understand this. Okay, one of the things that I found fascinating, and I worked with a student a couple years ago who was writing a thesis talking about consolidation of gains. And it was fascinating that in our Army doctrine, we say that Army commanders must exploit successful operations by continuously consolidating gains during competition, crisis, and armed conflict. Okay, we use the word must in our doctrine. But what's fascinating is nowhere in our doctrine do we tell people how you consolidate gains. And so, first, for those people going, what do you mean by consolidation of gains? So let's think about levels of war. The Army often talks about 3 levels of war. I think there are 5, but whatever, different levels. So tactical, operational, strategic are the 3 that the Army talks about a bunch. I offer technical and theater in there as well. So you start at the technical, tactical, operational, theater, and grand strategic. Okay, but if you think of these different levels of war, what consolidation of gains fundamentally is how do I turn success at one level of war into success at the higher level of war? That is consolidation of gains. Okay, is that ability to take success one level and turn it up to a next level. And I would offer that fundamentally consolidation of gains is about narrative war. So one of the reasons why the Israelis have struggled with the Palestinians, and whether that's the Palestinians or with Lebanon, so whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, the Israelis have struggled because the Israelis have not consolidated gains in either southern Lebanon or Gaza. Like, Israelis are quite technically and tactically proficient, but they have not been able to, and it's not just from lack of trying. Part of it is you could argue that they're not doing it the right way, but part of it is this ability of appreciating what the narrative space landscape looks like to then be able to conduct oneself in that narrative space to understand, because again, consolidation of gains, like, you need to understand the narrative space enough to know how much do I need to reshape it so that the ball will roll downhill, because consolidation of gains is all about downhill influence. Okay, so here's what I want to offer. Okay, so I talked about narrative space terrain having narrative space landscape having terrain. Just like normal physical space landscape has terrain, and that terrain can change, those are the same ways that narrative space landscape can change. So the landscape changes by erosion, by deposition, or by tectonic forces. So erosion is, we'll start. Deposition is just reinforcing, laying a new layer on top of the existing system, the existing landscape. Erosion is eating away at the existing landscape. And tectonic is radical change in the existing landscape. Now, what is important to recognize is radical change in the existing landscape with tectonic forces can happen seemingly quickly. But the reality, both in geology and in narrative, in the narrative world, it happens quickly and dramatically because of tensions that have existed in the geologic world, maybe for millions of years before the event, but in the narrative world, it might be for generations or even centuries before. So a tectonic event would be the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein and the removal of his government. We got rid of his government, and when we got rid of his government, that released a cork that basically radically transformed, like a volcanic eruption, radically transformed the narrative space landscape for Iraq. Okay, now the Americans were partly unprepared for that because we didn't understand the underlying tensions that existed within Iraq that would be released once we removed that cork from the bottle and the volcano exploded. So part of what we have to understand is, okay, what does the narrative landscape look like now? What does the narrative landscape need to look like for us to be able to consolidate gains? And then how much do we need to do? And this is an important part. So in the book, what I really tried to do at the end in particular is to try to make this appropriate for operators. Like, what are the questions you need to ask? And so I want to read a couple of the questions so the Appendix A in the book is just a list of questions. And so I start with first, well, I have a whole bunch of them, but I'll just list the first questions. And it goes, why is there a narrative war? What am I trying to achieve in the narrative war? Am I trying to understand my counterpart to more effectively communicate? Am I trying to understand my counterpart's narrative space so that I can more effectively influence my counterpart narratively downhill? Am I trying to reshape the narrative space landscape so that I can consolidate gains? So what is the purpose of the narrative engagement that you have? Am I just trying to understand it, or am I trying to reshape it, or am I trying to minorly reshape it, or am I trying to significantly reshape it? And in some cases, the better you understand it, maybe the more you realize I don't need to reshape all of it. I only need to reshape a little bit of it, because I don't need all of this to flow in one direction. I don't need to retilt all of the land this way. I just need to get a little gully or a little ravine to flow in the direction I want. And that might be all I need, right? But if you don't understand the narrative space landscape properly, then oftentimes we think we have to reshape the whole thing, which then causes people to throw their hands up in frustration because, oh, that's impossible, and we can't do that. And part of that comes out of frustration. And then I ask the question, what is the source of the opponent's will? What is the opponent's virtue or values? What is the strategy being followed? And what I mean by this strategy thing is this a domestic environment in a political context, which includes the corporate world, or against a perceived extremist actor? So the idea is that not all narrative strategy is the same. So if I'm dealing with a police force and I'm just trying to do things domestically, I'm trying to deal with crime in an inner city, or I'm a political campaign, or I'm a business, hopefully I already understand the domestic narrative space environment. I understand it very well intuitively. I grew up there. I know the neighborhoods. I know all the players. I know how this is shaped. So that is one level of narrative strategy. Another part is, let's say I'm expeditionary. So I'm going to invade. Now there's a couple levels of an expeditionary. I might be going to another country. Maybe I'm not invading. Maybe I'm doing humanitarian assistance. So there's been a big flood. There's been an earthquake. I'm going to help. Or I'm actually invading, like Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm toppling the government and I'm overthrowing everything. That is a radically different type of narrative strategy than a domestic strategy. The odds are I don't understand the environment very well. I have to understand, and now I'm thinking about radically, potentially in the case of invasion, reshaping the narrative space landscape to something that benefits me, right? And then a third party part, so if we're thinking about Taiwan, we don't have to necessarily imagine that we're going head to head with China over Taiwan. What we need to make sure is that state C, if we're power A and China's power B, that we want to make sure that our narrative or our story resonates well with state C's societal narrative, and maybe we want to disrupt or displace power B's story so that it doesn't resonate well, right? We want to increase the dissonance for power B and increase the resonance of our story at the same time. And then maybe like as in the Cold War or against us versus the CCP, but I would argue that this doesn't necessarily have to be us against the CCP. But in the Cold War, it was us against the Soviet Union, and that was a head-to-head narrative strategy fight. It was our story against their story. And so you need to understand, which one am I dealing with? How much do I need to understand? How much am I seeking to displace, and how much am I just seeking to disrupt? And how much of the narrative space landscape needs to be changed in what I am trying to get at. Now, all of this, when we turn this into an MDMP discussion, so much of this all starts in the mission analysis, in the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. How well do we understand the environment? If we want to understand, like if we're using some sort of maneuver annihilation, I want to understand how well, what does the enemy value that gives a given piece of terrain or a given control of an area a position of relative advantage? Because we use that term, position of relative advantage, but we don't act or think about it oftentimes as if relative advantage is different in different narrative space environments. So what's a position of advantage against an American force may not be exactly the same thing that's a position of advantage against a Russian force or against a Chinese force. It just depends. A lot of times we talk about terrain as if it's always equal no matter who you're fighting. And while that may mostly be true, it is not 100% true. And part of what you have to understand is why some terrain matters more than others. And I'll kind of maybe finish with this example. So when I was in Iraq in 2014, 2015, the CENTCOM commander, and we were planning the Battle of Mosul. And so the CENTCOM commander directed us to look at the Battle of Sadr City from 2008. And we looked at that battle. And one of the things that's fascinating, if you're not familiar, a bit of that battle is shown in the movie American Sniper with Bradley Cooper. And so one of the things is the Jaish al-Mahdi, or the Mahdi army from Muqtada al-Sadr's group, were launching rockets into the green zone. And so what we decided to do was we were going to put up the large T-wall barriers along what we called Route Gold. And we did that because we believed if we got their rockets beyond Route Gold, then they would not be able to range the green zone. Well, the Jaish al-Mahdi looked at Route Gold as a critical mobility corridor for them, and so they needed control. And so it ended up being that both sides saw Route Gold as critical or key terrain that needed to be controlled. And normally, when we fought with Jaish al-Mahdi, they used IEDs, and they fought in small groups. But because what we were doing along Route Gold, they started attacking us in larger sizes, and which made it easier for us to identify them with the surveillance assets we had, to track them back to their location, and to attack them in larger and larger groups, even at platoon size and sometimes larger than platoon size. And that had been very, very rare in our fighting in Iraq from 2004 to 2008. And so we effectively, within just a couple of days and weeks, eliminated Jaish al-Mahdi. They were no longer a player because we were able to get them, because they changed their behavior in response to what we were doing. And the lesson that I tried to take away from that, and that I was trying to ask the S2 to look at when we were planning the battle for Mosul, was there anything in Mosul that if we took it, ISIS would then attack us to regain that position? Because rather, the idea being, you cannot control the enemy's decisions, but what you can do is control your actions. And if you can, by controlling your actions, do something that will cause the enemy to change their behavior in such that it benefits you, then that's what you want to do. That's what you want to be able to that's how you want to behave. You do something that causes them, in this case, to attack you in larger numbers, which then advantages our firepower. And so I would argue that thought process is a part of understanding their narrative space landscape. What is going to cause them to roll downhill that favors your strengths, and then therefore will disadvantage them and allow you to have success. Obviously, there's a lot more to say on this topic. I mean, a lot more. And I would just invite everybody who has questions to reach out and connect. Like, I'm thrilled to talk about this as much as possible. And so you can reach out to me at narrativespace.net@gmail.com. You can go to my website, www.narrativespace.net. And there are links to the books that I've written, and there's also some training material that I've done for multiple units, and some other material there that you can access, as well as recommended reading and movies and so forth down the line. So I'm thrilled to help anybody, and certainly I'm thrilled to talk about this topic as much as possible.